No honor. In 16-year-old Abida's small Pakistani village, there are age-old rules to live by, and her family's honor to protect. And, yet, her spirit is defiant. And she yearns to make a home with the man she loves. When the unthinkable happens, Abida faces the same fate as other young girls who have chosen unacceptable alliances, certain public death. Fired by a fierce determination to resist everything she knows to be wrong about the society into which she was born, and aided by her devoted father, Jamil, who puts his own life on the line to help her, she escapes to Lahore and then disappears. Jamil goes to Lahore in search of Abida, a city where the prejudices that dominate their village take on a new and horrifying form, and father and daughter are caught in a world from which they may never escape. Khanwala village, Pakistan. 6.30 am. It was when they snatched the baby from her that she realized how serious the situation had become. She watched her twin brother, Aslam, wrap her daughter, his niece, in a filthy rag that he might have picked up in the stables. She could smell the damp fabric from where she lay on the floor. He tossed the knitted shawl she had made for the baby onto the ground. Tears burst from her eyes. "Give her back," she said, her voice hardly more than a whisper, her legs thrashing weakly on the floor. The midwife was cleaning up, her eyes darting towards Aslam as she hastily pulled a shalwar over Shabnam's legs, buttoning it at her waist. "Please, tell him to give my baby back to me." "She feds me," Shabnam begged. The midwife averted her eyes. "It is none of my business. You should have thought of that before you brought this filth into your home. You should be grateful your family asked me for help. Girls like you get thrown into the river if they're lucky, burned alive if they're not. Pray that your brother is merciful. A lot of brothers aren't." "Oh, she's one of the lucky ones," Aslam said. "Fortunately for her, Pir Sahab doesn't like fire. It draws too much attention." The midwife drew herself to her full height. "If that is what you had in mind, why did you ask me to help with the birth? What was the point? To make sure she doesn't avoid her real punishment?" Aslam said, his eyes gleaming. "Dying in childbirth is too good for the likes of her." The midwife's face drained of color. She hurriedly packed up her things and left the house without a backward glance. With a Herculean effort, Shabnam managed to prop herself on her elbows. The birth had utterly drained her. Every muscle in her body screamed. Her throat was parched, but she was too afraid to ask for water. There was no telling what Aslam might do. For now, he was captivated by the baby, playing with her tiny fists. Maybe he loves her enough, she prayed. Maybe their mother had her back to Shabnam, her heaving shoulders the only indication of her emotion. "How could you, Shabnam?" she whispered. "I begged you to run away." One glance at her son, and she changed gear. "How could you?" she said, louder this time. "Your father must be turning in his grave." Shabnam closed her eyes, her mind travelling back to the day when she had been goaded into giving herself to that man, the one she had been engaged to marry. He was 15 years older than she was, over 30, but when he suggested they take a walk down the river, no one batted an eyelid, least of all Aslam, whose eyes were fixed on the cartons of mangoes the man had brought for him. The man she refused even to think of him by his name had promised her the world. He had promised to take her to the big city. Her mother had done nothing to warn her about Men and their ways. When Shabnam had come of age, she had simply thrust a dirty rag at her and ordered her to use it to soak up the blood that came every month, but now she had accepted lavish gifts from the man, and had sent her 15-year-old daughter down the path of destruction. Shabnam didn't hold her greed against her. She only wished her mother hadn't raised her to be so naive. Shabnam had tried not to let her surprise show. When the man had led her into the fields, when his soft words tickled her skin, when he whispered fond things into her ear, making her blush with a mixture of fear and pleasure. Despite her ignorance, she had seen a few Punjabi films, and knew it was not commonplace for a man to ask a girl to shed her clothes. At first she resisted. But then she saw a shadow settle on the man's face, and her heart quailed. She thought of the cartons of mangoes at home, the countless rolls of silk and chiffon he had brought them, the satisfaction on her mother's face, and smiled her assent. Even then, she didn't know what she was agreeing to. It wasn't until she thought she was being split in two that she screamed, but there was no one to hear her. And now here she was at age 16, with a fiancé she'd not seen since that day, and a newborn baby ripped from her arms. All he wanted was your virginity, Aslam said. Don't fool yourself by thinking it was love. It wasn't even lust. These city boys are all the same, Per Sahab says. They come prancing in with sweet gifts and try to buy our daughters' innocence. And you spread your legs for him at the first opportunity. Her mother slapped her palms against her forehead. Hey, why did this happen to us? Because you gave birth to a connery, that's ain't a Kanjari who sold her honor for a few gifts. Percent. Shabnam didn't have the energy to argue with them. Her ears were trained towards the door. She could hear raised voices outside. Men's voices. Her mother shuddered as if something had blocked her windpipe. They're here, she whispered to her son, her voice choked with fear. Quick, open the door, or they'll burn the house down. Try to talk them out of it. Aslam smirked. Gladly. Aslam, no. Shabnam raised herself to her feet. The room spun in front of her, and she almost lost her balance. Give me the baby, please. I promise I'll leave and never come back. Aslam scratched his chin. What puzzles me is how you managed to hide your fat belly for so long. But, then, you've always been lazy. It was no real surprise to see you gaining more weight. His eyes darkened, and he directed his gaze at their mother. Did you know? Their mother put a hand on her heart. Of course not. What do you take me for? She had known for months, of course, and had said nothing, hoping against hope that the man would return. When 7 moons had passed since Shabnam's last blood, her mother had thrust a pouch at her, containing her life's savings and some jewellery, and pleaded with her to run away. By then it was too late. There were rumours of gangs of rapists prowling the neighbouring villages. Every day they heard of women being kidnapped and raped. Even if her mother had accompanied her, they wouldn't have been safe. These men had been known to rape women in their 70s, and there was no way she would have put her mother through something like that. Shabnam decided to face her fate. She wasn't going to run away. Now she wished she had. What a fool she had been to think her brother would support her. As the knocking became urgent pounding, she turned to her brother again. I'm her mother, she said. Have you no heart? When he Looked away, she tried the one thing she knew would get a response out of him. She took a hold of his free hand and held it on her breast where her milk welled. See? Can't you see she needs me? Aslam sprang away from her as if he'd been electrocuted. What kind of Kranyari would try to seduce her own brother? Shabnam wanted to slap him across the face. Anything to make him understand, but he held that precious bundle in his arms. Every thud on the door intensified the beat of her heart till she felt she would collapse. She leaned against the wall for her support. The room was thick with the smell of blood. The coppery taste of it clung to her mouth. Time was running out. As soon as Aslam opened the door, everything happened quickly. Her baby was shoved into the hands of a stranger, and Aslam, with a couple of other men, dragged Shabnam out of the house. Day was breaking and there was a nip in the air. She felt it on her exposed arms as she was pulled towards the village square. She was so weak that her vision was clouded and she caught only glimpses of the crowd of people who had gathered in the village square. It was only when they brought her face to face with the Pur that she saw the smile on his face, his hands folded over his belly. Take her to the riverbank, he said mildly. The cold morning air seemed to settle around her heart. Just beyond the row of thatched houses was a clearing by the river where the villagers often congregated for festivals. At this time of the year, the water would not be frigid, but it wouldn't be warm either. Courage, she whispered to herself. For my baby. A few of the older women spat at her as she was led down the road, the mud clumping around her ankles. Children threw dirt in her eyes, pulled at her hair. Haramal, they called her baby. Born outside marriage. Shame. Filthy Ranjari, Shabnam. Burn her alive. Shoot her. Drown her. Her brother smiled all through the procession, the beads of sweat on his forehead the only proof of his anger. Shooting her would be too easy, he replied to a man baying for her blood, the smile still fixed on his face. She needs to understand what she's done, and I need to restore my family's honor. Here, here, the crowd cheered. There's a man who knows what he has to do. Have carnival ground, with the trees cut back and inns are earth beneath their feet, but this place carried a hint of foreboding even at the best of times. Shabnam knew full well how many women had been tortured here. The current must be strong as she could already hear the water. Shabnam pleaded with Aslam with her eyes. She didn't have the energy to open her mouth. She pleaded for her baby. She knew she would die, but at least her baby could live. A part of her. Her brother seemed to read her mind. He held up a hand to silence the crowd. First he removed the rag that wrapped the baby. Bring a bucket of milk. No, she thought. You wouldn't dare. She didn't think she had the energy to speak, but when they lowered her child into the bucket, she wailed. The little one's cries died as soon as she vanished into the bucket, but Shabnam couldn't stop screaming. The milk sloshed over the edge, splashing onto the bare earth. Small bubbles rose to the surface, but soon the ripples settled. Good riddance, the Pur said. We must never let such filth tarnish our village. The baby was born out of wedlock. An abomination on this earth. Good work, my son. Aslam grinned, and for a moment he looked like the 16-year-old boy he was, not the demon he had just become. Shabnam hardly felt the breath leave her body as she was thrown into the river. She embraced the coolness of the water, and let it pull her down, away from the madness and pain. Peace, at last. Jamil. As they had every day for years, Jamil's eyes opened to the sound of a baby crying. His youngest, Shagufta, this time. His wife, Farida, tried to muffle the sound by swaddling the baby inside her kameez, close to her heart, but the shrill cries persisted. And to think babies were considered weak. Jamil rolled his eyes and shifted on his charpai, trying to go back to sleep. It wasn't yet April, and his kameez was already soaked in sweat. They should start sleeping outside soon. Through the open window he could see an orange dawn breaking over the wheat fields, rows of sparrows lined up on the wire that supplied electricity to their house. Jamil both loved and hated living so far from the village proper. While the distance allowed them some degree of freedom, it also meant that they faced the longest and most regular power outages. They seemed innocuous enough now, but in the heat of June, the absence of a fan could mean the children wailing the entire night. Jamil sighed. The day hadn't even started yet, and already he was thinking doleful thoughts. It would be time to get ready for work soon. Blood, feathers, and innards. That was his life as a butcher. No matter how hard he scrubbed underneath his nails, the smell of blood never quite left him. In the soft light he examined the palm of his hand, calloused. The skin as rough as sandpaper. His children cried if he stroked their cheeks, so he had stopped doing that. Besides, what father had ever shown affection for his children? He didn't want to appear weak. Beyond the rag hanging across the door frame, in the second room, the other children were beginning to stir. Too young, all of them. Jamil sighed. After Abida, they had tried for years to have another child, but without success. Just as they had given up, Farida had told him she was with child. The much-awaited son, Yusuf, came, followed by Abbas a year later. And then, the four daughters, Farhana, Nazaba, Sida, and Shagufta. Jamil couldn't remember what Farida had looked like when she was not expecting. He was afraid to get too close to her now, for fear that they'd have another. Her body was plump and inviting, but her eyes were vacant. And Jamil knew she didn't have it in her to carry another baby. They had been celibate since the birth of Shagufta. Is Abida up? He asked Farida, trying to ignore the sound of the suckling baby. He felt as if he was invading a private moment. She is supposed to help me with the chickens. Farida sighed. When has that girl ever helped you? Tell her to collect the birds for slaughter, and she'll play with them. I worry for her. 71. She's only 16, Farida. And for God's sake, you can say my name when we're alone. I was married at 14, Jamil. That was different. Times are changing. Farida huffed, shifting the now sleeping Shagufta to her shoulder and rubbing her back. Don't tell me a girl is too young to get married once she's had her blood. And Abida has been having her blood for years now. We ought to find her a husband. Rage stirred inside him at her tone, but he swallowed it. As soon as we have some money saved, we'll start looking for a suitable boy. Sell my jewelry and we'll make her a dowry. Don't forget, Jamil, you have 6 other children to worry about. Marrying her off would mean one less mouth to feed. Stung, he threw out his arm and gave her a sharp shake, disturbing the baby on her shoulders so that she fell into Farida's lap. Thankfully, Shagufta didn't wake up. How could you say that about your own Daughter. Farida began to cry. Jamil pulled at his hair. Farida, please forgive me. It's not like I slapped you. Come now, everything will be as you say. I will spread the word that we are looking for a suitable boy for Abida. Now stop crying. You'll wake the other children. She is 16, Jamil.we need to find someone now. You need to stop dawdling. His hand itched to smack her, but instead he pressed it against the thick jute of the charpai they were sitting on. Why do you think I let Pursahab order me around? His son has just returned from Faisalabad. He has more than 14 years of study under his belt. He had heard that Persidic had proper beds with feather mattresses in his home, and he hoped that one day his daughter would have one too. Jamil didn't have money for something so lavish. And anyway, the charpai was good enough for him and Farida. And in the punishing summer, the air circulated under the jute. Farida's eyes were as round as dinner plates, and the dupatta slid from her head, revealing the thick brown tresses he adored. 14 years. Yakuta, he must be a genius. Jamil smiled. Nothing less for my beloved daughter. But how will you manage it? The Pur is so rich and influential, his servants probably earn more than us. He's my friend, Farida, he replied coldly. He waved away her protests. Just leave it to me. Do you think he would hire our Yusuf as an apprentice? Farida was a good wife, a doting mother, but sometimes she could be dense. Jamil sighed. I'm trying to fix our daughter's marriage with the Pur's son, and all you can think of is Yusuf's apprenticeship. Has Pur Sahab given you any hint that he wants the same thing? No, I just dreamed the entire thing. Have some sense, Farida. She wasn't fully convinced, but the way her frown settled and her eyes went dreamy, he knew she had lapsed into her world of dreams, most of which had remained unfulfilled. Jamil intended to fulfill this one. He covered her hand with his. And I'm sorry. I shouldn't have shaken you like that. You know violence is not my style, but sometimes you go too far. But Farida's tears had dried long ago and, laying down the now sleeping baby, she opened her arms to him. It's forgotten, Jamil. Her dark eyes glittered, making her look a decade younger. The old playful Farida. Why don't we celebrate this decision? The children will sleep for a while yet. Are you sure? We can't afford another baby. Of course, I'm sure. I've picked up a few things about my body over the years. You may think your wife is a udlu. But I have some sense. Despite himself, a smile spread across his face as he took her in his arms. Nenawe. His high spirits evaporated when he opened his shop. The village was abuzz with the news of a Karo-Kari honor killing. Jamil's heart sank as the neighboring shop's owner, Naeem, recounted the events of the previous day. He closed his eyes when he learned that it was the brother who had pushed his sister into the river. And for what? Something that wasn't the girl's fault. All in the name of honor. He marveled that the man's contribution to the woman's plight went largely unnoticed. Tied her hands and threw her into the water like she was a sack of trash, Naeem said, his bottom lip quivering. Jamil interpreted it as distress, but then Naeem let out a loud laugh. The little Gusht1 thought she could get away with it. Giving birth to the spawn of Satan. Unmarried. Setting a bad example to other girls. It was a Relief when Pir Sahib intervened. Jamil was sharpening his knife. His head jerked up. And he set it down. Pir Sahib was behind this. Naeem grinned. Why, of course. If it wasn't for him, this village would have fallen prey to evil ideas from the city. Long ago. We're lucky to have him as head of the Jirga. Who else would have the guts for something like this? What did they do with the baby? Jamil asked quietly. Not wanting to hear the answer. Drowned her in a bucket of milk. What else? Exactly. What she deserved. Jamil closed his eyes. Just a baby. It wasn't uncommon, and Karo carries. Happened more frequently than anyone in this village would care to admit. His mother's face swam before his eyes and he thought of her back then, forever looking over her shoulder for the cousins who would murder her. He shook his head and opened his eyes again. He couldn't think of her. While Naeem was watching, any display of emotion for the dead girl could damage his reputation forever. Word would travel back to the people in the Jirga and to Siddiq. The Pir himself. Are you sure Pir Siddiq was behind the murder of the girl? Don't call it that. Naeem's tone was sharp. It wasn't a murder. Besides, can you blame a brother for trying to protect his family's honor? Every man has the right to marry a chaste wife of their choosing and raise his children with a family name that is pure. If his sister was dumb enough to get pregnant before marriage, she deserved to die. Some women are no better than animals. When lust overcomes them, I tell you. Most men too, Jamil countered. Men are allowed to be whatever they want. That's how it has always been and will always be. And doesn't that right extend to women? They. Words were out of his mouth before he could stop himself. To his surprise, Naeem laughed, his eyes crinkling. Up with 100 lines. Jamil Bhai, that was a good joke. Imagine if the women in this village were free to choose. Aren't things bad enough in the cities that you want our villages polluted with this too? It would be chaos, Jamil Bhai, chaos. He drummed his fingers on the wooden slab where Jamil kept his knives. We are lucky that the Jirga here takes honor seriously. Honor. Jamil didn't like the way the word rolled vs. over his tongue. Such a tricky thing. Without it, we are lost. Of course, Naeem Bhai. Jamil set down the knife he was sharpening. His hands were shaking and his heart thumped as if he'd run miles. Why, he thought to himself. Did he care so much about the girl who had been drowned? The answer came to him hours later as he was closing the shop. The ill-fated girl could just as easily have been a Bida.